perhaps, is something that I think goes almost without saying, really, is that I'm not in the least bit qualified to give a talk such as this. I'm not a geologist or a fossil expert of any kind. But of course, I suppose if I was a fossil expert or a geologist that had achieved any sort of measure of success in the scientific community, then of course I probably wouldn't be giving a talk such as this, because the universal flood, idea of that in relatively recent times, geologically speaking, is of course not something that really features in the worldview of such folk. So for them, then, looking through the prism of evolutionary things, the evidence that they see tells a very different story to that. And yet, for all of their expertise and undoubted intellect, they're wrong, are they not? And we know they're wrong because God has told us in Genesis, we just read it there a few moments ago, that there was a universal flood, one that occurred in the biblical time frame about 4,000 years ago. And if God tells us that something happened, then it happened. That's what we believe, isn't it, as Bible believers, why we're here this evening. Now, in all honesty, actually, I don't think you need to be any sort of expert to see the evidence of the flood in the world around us. You just need a set of eyes, really, and the ability to apply a bit of common sense logic. So I'm certainly not going to be blinding you with any sort of science this evening, even if I was remotely capable of such a thing. I'm just going to draw what seems to me to be fairly basic and obvious conclusions based on the evidence which we have before us. Now, no doubt there may be some out there who think, well, this is all a bit really unnecessary, really. I'm happy to simply believe what God has said without having to go any further and, look for all the evidence and things like that. And that's great, isn't it? That's a faith. That's the outlook we should have, really. That's ideal to trust, like a child would, what their parents tell them. But of course, we live in a world, don't we, where there are so many opposing narratives to the biblical one that, for me, at least anyway, it is important to know that it makes good logical sense to believe what God has told us. There is good tangible evidence that we can see with our own eyes, which backs up what we read in our Bibles. I think it's especially true, isn't it, for our young people today, most of whom, of course, exposed to these stories on a regular basis, whether at school or college or university, or just out there. So they need to know, don't they, that these things are not just for those who are gullible enough to believe them. Now, of course, when we do start to sit down and look at the evidence available to us, I suppose you could say we have something of an advantage, don't we, over our expert friends? Because rather than having to fathom out what happened by looking at the evidence, we know what happened. We're not in any doubt, are we, that there was a universal flood. And so we can then work backwards from that time. So we can begin by saying, we know a universal flood happened, because it's there in the historical record of Scripture. So given that, then, what evidence would we expect to find as a result of that? So, you might say, well, that's not a particularly scientific approach, and I'd agree, but it is nonetheless quite an interesting journey, I think, for us to go on. So before we think of the evidence, then we need to have some sort of grasp about what we might expect to find. We have to think about the sort of things that were going on during the flood. So let's put ourselves then for a moment in the position of an imaginary eyewitness. to all this. We're on the ground, perhaps on the ark even, recently completed on that day we just read about there in Genesis chapter 7, verse 11, the 600th year of Noah's life, second month, 17th day of the month. That's the day when these fountains of the great deep were broken up and the windows of heaven were opened. So suddenly then we've got an enormous amount of water coming from two directions, the bottom of the sea, presumably, and from the sky. Now, not only that, we also have more than a suggestion that at this time there is a good deal of tectonic activity going on. So we have, for example, the breaking up of the fountains of the deep, which would seem to indicate some sort of tectonic activity. We'll return to that idea in a moment, but for now, let's just make the assumption that what's going on is earthquakes and volcanoes and such like around about this time. So what effects would all that have then? What would we see and experience from our vantage point here on top of the ark? I don't think we really have to use our imagination all that much because, of course, we do see the effects of flooding on a fairly regular basis. So this week, didn't we? In fact, right now in Scotland, I believe, it happens all the time. We know what a flood looks like and what kind of devastation it can wreak. So this is a while ago now. It's New South Wales in Australia. Historical floods, as I said. So in actual fact, it was 4 days of heavy on and off rain. But you can see the depth of water that's been built up there from 4 days of intermittent rain. And imagine what it would be like then for 40 days and nights of very intense rain. Plus, of course, a very dramatic sea level rise as water comes from these fountains of the deep. And of course, even from a relatively small scale, the sort of floods that we see in our day, we see huge effects, don't we? We see houses washed away, bridges washed away, we have landslides all over the place, and so on and so forth. So we can begin to kind of imagine, can't we, the kind of devastating effects of the sort of flood that we read about in Genesis. I think we also have to consider the possibility of tsunamis at this time. Remember, we suggested tectonic activity. Well, we know what happens, don't we? When there's an earthquake underneath the sea, you get tsunamis. And again, we've seen in the past what sort of devastation a tsunami can cause. No one tsunami can wipe a whole town off a map, can't it? So just to kind of summarize the sort of things that we think are likely to have been going on during the time in the flood. So we have the historical record of the Bible. What we're trying to do here is to kind of fill in the gaps with the details that we're not told, but surely would have been happening at this time. So there would have been, erosion of the soil on an absolutely massive scale. So we've got rivers bursting their banks, I would have thought, fairly early on, and then lakes and even inland seas then perhaps bursting their banks, water rushing away and washing away, scouring out millions of tons of soil and rock, pretty much down to the bedrock, you would think, in some places. And all that sediment, and indeed all that, the plants and the animals which have been caught up in all that, ending up there in suspension, if you like, in the water column. And underneath the water, you get huge underwater currents, wouldn't you? Which scour everything and carry that sediment, carry those bodies, and the remains of all the plants and the trees and whatever under the water, and then depositing them in one place or another. And then perhaps sometime later you get a fresh influx of deposit, which would come from somewhere else and be settled down then on top of the freshly laid layers. So that's the sort of thing you'd expect. Of course, we've got the tectonic activity we've been proposing, these earthquakes, the volcanoes, and such like. So let's just think about that for a moment. And why are we particularly keen on the idea of the tectonic activities? Well, we've seen, the phrase "fountains of the deep," and we suggested that seemed to indicate some violent tectonic activity. But I think there's more to it than that. If you start with a situation that we have today in the world and kind of work backwards, we can see, and we know, of course, that the world map is made up of many separate land masses and islands, which are separated, of course, by the sea. But we understand, don't we, that these land masses are attached to continental plates, which are distinct from each other, and they move around, don't they, and bump into each other and separate from each other. But the key fact, I think, I want just to hone in on, is that on pretty much every substantial bit of dry land in the world, we find land animals, don't we, of different types. In actual fact, often on a separate and isolated landmass like Australia or Madagascar, you get a particular set of land animals which are unique to that particular landmass. Now, you scratch your head, you think, well, how did that then come about? Given that we know that all surviving land animals, all those different kinds, not species, kinds, were deposited in one place on the Earth's surface, mountain in Ararat, after the flood. Now, logically, if you think about it, the only way that kangaroos had a kangaroo, didn't we? The only way that kangaroos got to Australia, for example, is that one time after the flood, it was possible to walk or to hop from Mount Ararat to Australia on the land. Something, of course, which now is completely impossible to do. But less than 4,000 years ago, it seems, it was possible. And it provides, I think, a reason why we get these unique collections of animals on these isolated land masses. Because, of course, birds of a feather, as they say, flock together. So as they dispersed around the world, these groups of animals, originally, of course, just a pair, they would no doubt replicate. They would find themselves then at a dead end, and then be cut off and isolated as that landmass separated away from the rest. The bridge, as they call it, over which they come, disappeared. And so they were isolated and separated. Now, in the beginning, of course, we know that God created the land and the sea. And it would seem logical, wouldn't it, to assume that at the beginning it was just one single land mass, which then broke up to form these separate land masses that we get today. And I think the presence of land animals in Australia, for example, indicates that this happened round about the time of the flood. Now, of course, in today's world, the movement of these land masses, these continental plates, is extremely slow. It's millimeters or inches per year. We might assume, I think, that back then, in these very chaotic days, it was rather more speedy as we get the beginnings of continental breakup and continental drift. And of course, we know what happens, don't we, when we get continental plates moving around and bumping into each other. One goes underneath another, you get the formation of mountains. The Earth being lifted up by the pressure of the plate going underneath. Again, that's happening very slowly today, but back then we might suggest it was much faster. During this period, we have a period of rapid mountain building, we could surmise. So that is to say that the mountains which existed before the flood were maybe nowhere near the size that they are today. So when we read that the water covered the mountains to a depth of 15 cubits, we're not talking about Mount Everest height. Nothing like that, much likely, much less, perhaps even more than what we would call hills. So alongside this movement of continental plates, of course, and mountain building, you would naturally, wouldn't you, get a lot of earthquakes, a lot of volcanoes. We know that that sort of thing goes along with this sort of tectonic activity. Now, while I was looking at this, the latest time I did, I was very interested to come across this from the internet. This is from a joint study, actually, between America and Canada in 2014. And they discovered the presence of this layer about 400 miles underneath the Earth's surface, which they called the transition zone. And this zone contains a mineral which they're called ringwoodite, which acts a bit like a sponge. It kind of traps water. And it's been calculated in this study that there was 3 times the amount of water that is currently in the world's oceans is trapped in that layer 400 miles under the Earth's surface. Now, what was particularly interesting, I think, is the suggestion there in point 3 on the screen there, that the water that we see on the Earth's surface now may have come from this layer and forced to the surface by geological activity. So geological activity, tectonic movements and so on, has the potential, they say, to turn the taps on, as it were, to bring that water up from deep underneath the Earth's surface. What did we just read in our Bibles a few moments ago? On that day, the fountains of the great deep were opened up. Now, one thing that's often said by those who seek to discredit the idea of a universal flood is they say, well, where did all that water come from? There isn't enough water in the world to cover the tops of the mountains. We've already suggested, haven't we, that the mountains were perhaps not the same sort of scale as the mountains that we see today. But further now, we could say, well, here is where all that water is. It's there 400 miles underneath the ground, 3 times the amount of water in the world's oceans. So once again, that modern discoveries have really supported rather than discredited the veracity of Scripture. Now, while we're at it, I think we might as well consider very briefly the idea of a local flood. That it wasn't a universal or kind of global event, but rather than affecting the entire planet, it just was a local flood which affected one part of the world, perhaps in the region of Mesopotamia, somewhere like that. Now, this is something which has long been suggested, and indeed continues to be expressed by some. But quite frankly, without meaning to be in any way disrespectful, I cannot fathom why this is. If we're going to believe what the Bible tells us, then let's believe what the Bible tells us. Either we accept it or we reject it. Why do we look for some sort of halfway kind of house? We're told, aren't we, that the water prevailed from 15 cubits upward. The mountains were covered. In other words, there were at least 15 cubits depth of water from the highest mountain, over the highest mountain. I think that picture says it all, doesn't it? If water is covering the mountains in China, it's going to be covering the mountains in Scotland, isn't it? That's what water does. It finds its own level. But more than that, I think when we read Genesis 7, as we did, the record is at pains to point out the universality of this event. I will destroy from the face of the earth all living things I have made. All the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. The mountains were covered. All flesh that moved died. All in whose nostrils was the breath of life. All on the dry land died. He destroyed all living things. on the face of the ground. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive. You ask yourself, what more could God say to convince us that there's not just a little flood which affected some province of Mesopotamia? This was a truly global event, which means all the high hills were covered, all flesh died, land animals, all living things on land. So this, of course, is an inspired word, isn't it? It's not written from human perspective. It's written from God's perspective. It's God speaking. He has that global view of events. So moving on then, we thought about those things which we might expect to happen in the flood, such as one described in Genesis 7, and we surmised there would be massive erosion going on, and indeed the deposition of sediment. With all that sediment and stones and rocks and plants and animals and carried away by the water. And of course, over time, as things kind of calm down a little bit, they would fall out of suspension, wouldn't they? Those things out of the water column on the floor and build up there on the floor. So given that, what would we expect to see as a result of that in the world today, if that is indeed what happened? Well, what you'd expect to see, I would suggest, is fossils of all of those dead bodies of the animals and the plant matter having been deposited from the water column and rapidly buried under a thick layer of sediment. So you'd expect to see fossils all over the world, including on the tops of the mountains. We're told the whole world was covered, even to the tops of the mountains. And that's exactly what you do see, of course, in real life. Even at the top of Mount Everest, can you believe there are fossils of sea lilies? That's proof positive, absolute proof that at one time Mount Everest was covered in water. Now, it is universally recognized and taught in schools that fossils form when the thing that died is covered by sediment which is carried by water. Okay, so the diagram there, I just took it from an average textbook, sets this out. So the animal dies, it's covered by water, water brings sediment covers the body with a thick layer, and that causes over time those bones to fossilize. Now, in this particular example, they suggest that this sequence happens very gradually. But of course, in natural fact, that cannot be the case, can it? Dead bodies do not lie around for thousands of years. They decompose, they get eaten by other animals. Those bones get scattered around the place. In my job, I walk around the countryside, I see plenty of dead sheep, for instance. Now you see a dead sheep one year, you're lucky after a year to see anything other than a skull, let alone an entire skeleton, complete and intact. If a land animal dies in the world today, it is extremely lucky or unlucky, depending on how you view it, to end up as a fossil. It simply doesn't happen. It has to be covered by water and sediment shortly after, or indeed during, its demise. Now, one thing which is perhaps worth mentioning, although talks here about bones being fossilized and turned into stone, matter of fact, many of the so-called fossils which are dug up and presented in museums as fossils are actually skeletons. They are real bones, in some cases fur and flesh as well. Now, the fact that we have got fossils at all around the world in vast quantities, including fossils of enormous land animals, tells us, I think, something important. It tells us that all of those animals and plants were rapidly covered with sediment a short time after their death. Now, the only time, as we said, that happens, apart from a peat bog scenario, is in flood conditions, when that body is covered by water. I'm not being controversial here by any means. This is how fossils are created. Everybody knows that. It's taught in our schools. And you just think for a moment how much sediment it would take to completely bury a body of a Brontosaurus, for example, or a Tyrannosaurus Rex, to a depth to enable it to fossilize. Clearly, we are talking about a catastrophic event. Now, you probably recognize this, I expect. This is a picture of the Grand Canyon in America, I think it is, or Canada, I can't remember. Anyway, enormous gorge in Arizona. Very popular with tourists, of course. It's also popular with geologists because it has these very clear layers, these bands in the rock, which are made up of various different types of rock. So you have sedimentary rock, such as limestone, sandstone, and shale, sitting on top of basement rock, as they call it, made of igneous or metamorphic rock. And these layers have all been identified and marked, and they're there in this diagram. It's just one portion, a sample of that canyon. So if you cast your eyes over to the right there of the diagram, you can see two columns there next to those layers, and there's lots of very small numbers. I don't suppose you can see those at all. But one column, the far right column, tells us the layer thickness in feet. Okay, and the column next to it tells us the layer age in millions of years. So we can tell, for example, the Red Wall limestone is 500 feet thick, and that took 340 million years to form. So there is an obvious correlation here between the thickness of the layer and the time it took the layer to form. The thicker the layer, the more millions of years it took to form. So this kind of represents, current scientific thinking, doesn't it? As to how sedimentary rocks are created, very slowly, millimeter by millimeter, building up in a kind of glacial pace. So a foot represents 700,000 years of history, and this process has continued uninterrupted, really, for 4 billion years or so. That's essentially, I suppose, the theory of uniformitarianism, isn't it? That all things continue as they were from the beginning. Now, when you first come across this, it seems to make some sort of sense, doesn't it? After all, if you want to find some sort of historical artifact, then you have to dig down to find them, don't you? And generally speaking, the older things are, the deeper they are, the more you have to dig. But then you think a little bit more, and you think, actually, this makes no sense whatsoever. The question begs to be asked, doesn't it? Why do you only get one very specific type of sediment being deposited for hundreds of millions of years, and then suddenly overnight that disappears and is replaced by another very different sort of sediment, and from then on, and from millions of years after that, only that new sort of sediment is laid? Now, I cannot think of any kind of natural process or mechanism which would cause that to happen. However, there is a natural process which is universally recognized, again, which does very much result in the sorting of sediments in this way, and thereby the formation of layers. And it is this: it's sedimentation, the settling of particles in a column of water. So we had a little go at this the Ammerford Youth Weekend, actually. Sorry, not Youth Weekend, the Ammerford Weekend, isn't it? A few years back. So the young folk tried this out, but a selection of different sized particles in the water, in the jar. They shake it up, and of course those particles settle out at different speeds. resulting in those defined layers. It's not rocket science. It's not like groundbreaking. It's a recognized thing that kids do at school. Now, if you take it out of the jar, of course, and scale it up to planetary levels, those layers, of course, go on in time then to form different types of sedimentary rock. Just as you see, of course, in the Grand Canyon, and indeed over 80 to 90% of the Earth's surface. And that is exactly what you would expect to see as a result of the Genesis flood. That is what would happen, as all those vast quantities of sediment caught up by flood action, they then subsequently settle out in the water column into layers. Now, where the kind of gradual build-up theory really breaks down, as far as I can see, it is when you introduce the presence of fossils, such as are found in layers of sedimentary rock across the world in huge numbers. In fact, you get these index fossils, as they're called, which typically found in certain layers. They're used then to theorize the age of that fossil. It's based on the depth that layer is typically found. So if you want to know how old a layer is, you look at the fossils that are in it. You want to know how old a fossil is, you look at the layer it is in. It is a kind of circular sort of argument, which is underpinned really by the assumption that these layers of rock form very gradually over hundreds of millions of years. I've already looked, haven't we, at the process of fossil formation. We've seen that fossils only form when that dead body or plant is rapidly buried with sediment. So you can see the kind of fundamental problem here. On the one hand, we're being told that these layers have taken hundreds of millions of years to form, millimeter by millimeter. On the other hand, we're being told that fossils are found in layers that are formed rapidly, and things are rapidly covered with sediment. But you can't have it both ways, can you? The fact that there are fossils in these layers tells us the truth about this matter. These sedimentary rocks which contain fossils did not take millions of years to form. If they did take millions of years to form, then they would not contain any fossils. They must have been laid rapidly in flood conditions, because that is how fossils form. Now the picture becomes a little bit more clear when we see this sort of thing. This is what's called polystrate fossils. So in this case, it's a trunk of a tree, which lies vertically in the midst of several different layers. Now, traditional theory tells us that those layers took millions of years to form. But of course, that can't be the case, can it? Because trees do not stay standing for that long, waiting to be fossilized. In fact, you even get tree trunks which are fossilized upside down. So their roots are pointing up, again, spanning through many of these layers. Now you think to yourself, what scenario, apart from a flood scenario, would explain that? That has to be the result of a tree being ripped out of the ground and moved to that location and rapidly buried upside down. So you don't have to be an expert really to look at these things. Just use our eyes and a bit of common sense. And then you get these so-called fossil graveyards, and there were a lot of these around the globe, in the Gobi Desert, China and New Mexico, Alberta in Canada. The picture we got there on the screen is a Nebraska bed in Nebraska. Sorry, it's the Ashley beds in southern US. So these are the fossilized remains of hundreds of thousands, in some cases millions of animals, all jumbled up and laid on top of one another. say the example here we have is of the Ashley beds in Nebraska. It's a mixture of land and sea animals, all mixed up and fossilized. And the extent of this is absolutely mind-boggling. It covers tens of square miles. There's hundreds of meters thick, full of fossils on top of each other. So, and actually, he was describing this particular bed in Alberta, in Canada. The gentleman who worked on it said this. He said, "Data from this mega bone bed provide pretty clear evidence that these and other dinosaurs were routinely wiped out by catastrophic tropical storms that flooded what was once a coastal lowland here in Alberta 76 million years ago." So this gentleman obviously doesn't believe in the Genesis flood, but it's undeniably the case, as he says, that these animals met their end as the result of an enormous catastrophe. And I would suggest on a far larger scale than a local storm. Because, of course, tropical storms happen many times a year in certain locations, and you never get anything like this being formed as a result. This is something on an entirely different scale. As we said, these fossil graveyards, they're found all over the world, very often in areas not known for storms. And it's hard to think, isn't it? It's hard to think of any other way that this would happen other than a massive flood scenario where you get enormous rafts of dead bodies, all killed at the same time in one huge catastrophe, all brought together and swept into one place by massive water currents, and then sinking and being rapidly covered by a thick layer of sediment, so they become fossils. No other chain of events that we can think of would explain the existence of this sort of thing. But it is, of course, exactly the sort of thing you would expect to find had there been the universal flood of the sort that the Bible records. Now, time is up. Much more we might want to say, but hopefully they will share just some reasons why, certainly I believe, that it makes sense to believe in the Genesis flood actually happened. The very ground upon which we walk, I think, bears clear witness to it. And of course, it all helps us to believe, doesn't it, that the truth of Scripture ultimately helps us to believe in God himself. And more than that, it tells us that God is a God who judges. He has done it before, at the time of Noah. And in fact, when we see these fossils, they are, I believe, in the main, we are seeing the world as it was then, caught up in the flood, which was brought about, of course, because of the wickedness of man. So what we have here really is a reminder, isn't it, of the judgment to come, and the need to prepare ourselves for that time, just like Noah, obedient to God's commands. And inside that structure which he has created for us, the temple of believers, so we may be saved by his grace in that day.